I'm Jordan Hatfield. This is Faster Film Critic. Today on the show, we talk Anora with Kolter and Chase Fugel. Anora is a 2024 romantic drama directed by Sean Baker, starring Mikey Madison, Mark Edelstein, Yura Borisov, and Karin Kargulian. If a bunch of pissed-off Russians ever find their way into your candy store, I suggest you tread lightly. Get in! We're going cinephiling. Gentlemen, how are we doing today?
Good. How you guys doing?
Great.
I'm really excited to talk Anora, but before we dive in, I gotta ask, have you seen other Sean Baker films?
Yeah.
What have you seen?
Florida Project and Tangerine, although it's been a hot minute.
I've only seen Florida Project, but I loved it.
Yeah.
I loved it.
Sean Baker is a very interesting filmmaker, and he's becoming one of my favorite. He often deals with subjects that are very heavy and complex, subjects that are often shunned by the general society, that are viewed maybe as immoral. He's been referred to as a garbage artist, which is a title I do not like, but it's one that I definitely understand. His main characters are often in very difficult situations, either because of a series of their own bad decisions or just the reality that they were born into. You know, he may tell a story about a prostitute or a trans individual or a migrant who's come to this country and struggling. They're often minority groups and on the fringes of society. They're struggling emotionally, and I find myself emotionally drawn into his stories.
Yeah.
And I love that about his films. They can be eye-opening, and they're real. There's something about his films that are just so real.
Yeah.
And I love and appreciate that about his storytelling.
Yeah.
They're so human. They're so human.
That's a great way to
and
put
it's these little things that usually Hollywood doesn't like to expand upon. These situations that's easier to just disregard.
Yeah.
His films are not ones that you just put on and sit back and relax.
No.
And let the TV's warm glow just wash over you. Like that's
drag
not
you into a
films.
deep depression. Yes.
You come away from them and you're thinking about them, and there's deep meaning behind his films, and they're psychological in a lot of ways. And again, I just have so much respect for him as a filmmaker. I'm very excited, very, very excited that he got so much praise in the award season this year.
Yeah.
And I'm very, very excited to see what he does next.
Yeah.
Me too.
Dude brings a tremendous amount of complexity and realism to the characters in his movies. Man, it just it permeates you emotionally, and you're kind of left in a place that's not that far away from the characters, at least for a little bit. His movies kind of tend to really, at least for me, they really hung with me after watching them.
Yeah, and he's an independent filmmaker.
Yep.
His earlier films are incredibly low budget. In fact, Tangerine was shot on an iPhone.
Yeah, yeah.
The entire film was shot on an iPhone.
Yeah.
Crazy.
I love his story. Love everything about Sean Baker. Another thing that I want to point out is during this award season, he called people out to support movie theaters.
Yeah, good, because they need it.
During his speech, he was like, people, the whole artwork of movies is under threat.
Yeah.
This is a social activity that we will lose if we are not careful. We need to get together. We need to go to movies at the movie theater. We need to talk about movies. We need to keep this art alive.
Yeah.
He's passionate about that, as am I, and I just love to see it. So, mad respect for Sean Baker.
For sure, man. Dude, the challenge with a lot of these movies, up to and including in Anora, because they're largely kind of art house films, they tend to have a limited release. So they're not always appealing to a broad audience. So, even in big cities, you have to travel to an art house theater like Lemley in the LA area. Dude, out here in the middle of Wyoming, it's either not shown at all, or I got to drive 5 hours to a big city to go be able to check it out, or wait for it to come on streaming. And then by then, movies at home are great. They don't smack the same as they do in the theaters. They just don't.
No, they don't. You're right. Anora didn't open up here for a long time.
Yeah.
I wanted to do a show on Anora when it first came out.
Yeah.
And yet I couldn't see it.
Yeah.
Salt Lake City's got a pretty big market when it comes to film, and yet it didn't come here either.
Yeah.
It eventually did, but it was several weeks later, and it bummed me out. But
maybe they just, the Mormons didn't have a market for this kind of film.
His films, you're right, his films, they're not always easily accessible. I mean, as a general audience, going to see a movie about a sex worker, going to see a movie about a trans person, it's got a limited appeal. But
it does.
If you give it a chance, the message in his stories, despite the language or despite any nudity or any of that, the message of his stories are absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And I think that's a perfect segue into Anora.
Yeah.
Agreed.
What if we do this? Anora really is a 3-act movie.
Very much so.
There are 3 distinct acts. Let's take them one by one.
Okay.
All agreed?
Yeah.
Any opposed?
Nay.
So Act 1, we meet Annie, and we very quickly learn that she is a sex worker. She's a stripper.
Yes.
And not only is she a stripper, but she lacks true, real, authentic human connection.
Yeah.
And I don't know what her history is.
Yep.
But I imagine that she has been hurt, probably severely.
Sure.
She's come from a broken home, and she's built this wall around her, and she is tough.
And it seems like this wall has been built for protection, being in this industry.
Yep.
Like she needs this wall to survive.
Yeah.
She's a tough girl. She's a fighter.
Yep.
She is abrasive, and she doesn't mind telling you exactly what she thinks.
Right.
Several times in the movie, she's asked her about her family, and she dodges it. She doesn't want to talk about her family.
No.
That's not a place she wants to go, and I think this suggests that she had some family struggle, and that probably had a lot to do with where she is in both the world today and where she is personally, within herself.
Yeah.
As a sex worker, she gets this call from Vanya. Vanya is a rich Russian kid, man. This kid is super wealthy.
Yeah.
He's 21, I believe. He's here in New York City on vacation, and he's just partying big before he has to go home and work for his dad.
Mm-hmm.
He's living in this mansion that his dad owns. He's got all the money in the world. What do you guys think of Vanya when you first meet him?
I was really unsure of him, but I also was kind of drawn to him.
Yeah.
There's some uncertainty when she jumps into this
for sure.
relationship, but you're also kind of along for the ride with her. Like there's something so interesting about him.
Yeah, the way it plays out, it's to your point, Chase. I think you put it really well. It's we're kind of viewing how we see him through Annie's eyes. There seems to be some sense of that she's giving him a chance, that she's detecting some kind of sincerity in him. But we also know what she does for a living. Her job is to kind of manipulate stupid men into giving her money. And I think what the first act does really successfully is it pulls us into this false sense of security about the characters. And they're both getting something out of this very transactional relationship. You get right away that he's the kid of an oligarch, a Russian oligarch. That's probably not going to be a great thing. Inevitably, it's going to spell trouble. I was waiting for the bad things to start to unravel. You're hopeful maybe, but you're also skeptical.
That's funny because I had a little different experience, Kolter. I meet Vanya, and he's this rich kid, right, with all the money in the world. There's a very clear depiction of the class struggle between these two characters.
Absolutely.
Despite all his wealth, he's got emotional struggle himself. He doesn't have a good relationship with his parents. In fact, you can say he hates them.
Yeah.
He meets Annie, and he hires her as an escort because she speaks Russian.
Yeah.
And he likes her.
Yeah.
He eventually offers to pay her to be his girlfriend for the week on this vacation.
Yeah.
And during this time, as I'm getting to know Vanya, I'm starting to see something in him that I kind of like, that's kind of charming. He's very immature.
Sure.
And that comes through. And so he comes across as a very selfish, rich kid, right?
Yeah.
But there's also something about him that I'm rooting for. As the relationship between he and Annie starts to develop and they fall in love and he proposes, I recognize that the relationship was shallow. And I recognize that the relationship was not one of true love.
Yes.
But there was something about the relationship that I found to be beautiful, and I found that to be touching.
Yeah.
And I was really, really hoping that this relationship would work out. And I did not expect it to unravel. At this point in the film, I was thinking this was a Cinderella story.
Yeah.
I was thinking these two were going to fall in love, and the rest of the story was going to be them fighting for their love.
I kind of had the same idea, too. And I was okay with it, because there was that weird charm, which is so weird because you see, these kind of rich, self-centered, immature people. It just draws in other people.
Oh, yeah.
And I look at it from an outside perspective. I'm like, I just can't understand it. I'm like, what are you thinking? Why are you drawn to this person? They're so selfish. They're so...
Agreed.
I can't even see it. And then this movie was like, okay, I see it. I
immediately felt like we were made to think we... knew who these characters were. And then it wasn't long before my suspicions were confirmed that we slowly start to discover that they are not who we think they are as people, save for maybe a character or two. But there's a lot of that kind of throughout this. Some of it really, really worked, and some of it I thought was just obviously predictable.
I mean, there's no question that sex is transactional for Annie.
Absolutely.
And for her, sex is performative. It's void of real, authentic human connection, as that work is for anyone, I imagine. And at the same time, Vanya, this rich kid out of Russia, doesn't have any human connection either. They're in the same boat on opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
He's got no connection with his family. He cares about sex, drugs, and video games. His whole being is about instant, quick gratification.
Sure.
There's nothing real about the way he's living, and his human connection either. And so when they came together, I saw, oh my goodness, here's Annie, who's in a very difficult job that has to be incredibly challenging from an emotional perspective, incredibly challenging from a physical perspective.
Yeah.
And here's a ticket out for her.
Right.
And we're trained through all the movies that we've seen growing up
Yes.
to root for that. And
Right.
I found myself rooting for her. And at the same time, I saw Vanya, this rich kid with no human connection, falling in love with this girl. And I thought, here is his ticket out,
Yeah.
right? They're both saved from their ends of the spectrum and they could meet in the middle. But then, like you say, everything starts to unravel.
Yeah.
And then we enter the second act of the movie. And this is where Vanya's parents find out that he's married this American escort, and they are pissed.
Sure.
And they send their goons to break this up.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Vanya, when he's faced with these goons, rather than deal with it like a man, he runs.
Right.
And he leaves his fiancée alone in the house to deal with these goons all by herself.
Yeah.
The entire tone of the film at this point shifts. And I want to know from this scene on, what did you guys think? What were you feeling?
I loved it. You know, these people come in looking for Vanya, and you watch Annie both convincing them and herself that he's going to come back, that he's going to save her or he's going to get help or something. And that is a really painful thing to watch. And also, you understand it.
Act 2 is where it kind of started.
Oh, no.
No, Act 2 is where it started kind of getting more interesting for me. So Act 1, I struggle with Act 1 a little bit because we know Annie is this tough-spirited kind of person trying to make her way in the world. We don't know much. Jordan, you mentioned this. We don't really see her struggle with any of her responsibilities. We don't see her, other than she's sleeping until noon. She forgot to bring home milk. There's possibly a strained relationship between who I assume is her sister that she lives with. Other than that, I don't get the sense that she's particularly unhappy with her choices, that she's struggling all that much. Because of these walls that she puts up and this kind of tough spirit, I'm just not rooting for her very much. And then when Vanya comes into the picture, I'm too skeptical. Even though he shows these kind of fleeting moments of seeming sincerity, I'm not trustful. So when Act 2 kicks in, all of a sudden it injects the movie with this frenetic energy and kind of chaos. And, you know, the whole struggle between her, what I liked about Act 2 is when we're introduced to Igor and Garnik. Garnik is this Armenian goon. Igor is this Russian goon. And they're played against type. Right away, we're assuming they're going to kick the door in. They're going to manhandle these two. They're going to get out what they want. And they're gentle and they're measured and they're passive and they're not overly forceful. And right away, I'm like, that's interesting. That's kind of one of Sean Baker's trademarks, man, is that some of the side characters in his movies have this density and development that all of a sudden I'm more interested in their journeys and their plights. They were more interesting than the main characters. You know, you get Garnik, who gets kicked with both feet by Annie as they're struggling with, you know, and this whole Act 2 takes this very bumbling goons thing that we've seen this trope a lot of times in other movies. But for me, it worked. It kind of injected a much needed, a little bit of mystery, especially with Igor. He's a man of few words, but and he's the muscle, but he doesn't act like the muscle. Yeah. And then you've got Toros, who's this godfather who's contacted by Vanya's parents to go take care of this situation, force them to get an annulment. You could argue that the scene goes on for too long. It's a little exhausting. It kind of wears on you, all the screaming and the fighting and the back and forth, and expertly, competently depicted. But it takes a turn to me for the far more interesting following Act 1. And that's when I kind of became more invested in the side characters, what was going on with them, than I did caring about either Vanya or Annie.
Forgive me for pointing out the obvious, but Act 1 is vital to the story. It sets up everything else that's going to happen. We're introduced to Annie and Vanya. We get to know a little bit about them and their characters. But you're right, Kolter, in Act 2, we get to know the side characters.
Yeah.
And they are an integral part of the story.
Very much.
And this is true with all of Sean Baker's films.
Yep.
All of his side characters have such an emotional draw. And that's one thing I love about his writing. And in Act 2, we get to see more of the fight in Annie. We get to see more of her strength, right? She's holding on to the Cinderella dream.
Yeah.
But this is where we really get to see Igor and who he is and what he's about. And he becomes central in Act 3.
Yeah.
And one thing that happens in Act 2, largely, it happens in all acts, but there's a lot of comedy in this film. More comedy than I expected.
Yeah, there is, actually, yeah. It's hilarious. Like, Garnick is essentially suffering from a concussion for the rest of the movie. And he plays it so well. There's scenes where he's in the background and he's just watching. Like, there's a scene in a restaurant where Toros is berating a group of young Armenians for being lazy and unachievers. And during that scene, at some point, it switches to a kind of a 3-shot of Garnick, Igor, and Annie sitting at this table. And Garnick's just like watching what's going on, and his eyes are blinking slowly and like independently of each other. And he just plays that like he's barely hanging on. He keeps whining the whole time about, could you take me to a hospital, please? You know, he's throwing up all over himself. And it's like, shit, man, I feel bad for this guy. Like, he didn't do anything necessarily to get 2 shoes to the face, and now he's trying his best to make it through the rest of this debacle. And I thought those little moments worked so well. And it was tasteful, moments of comedy. It wasn't like unnecessary or unwarranted. It worked. Those characters to me were far more interesting.
Agreed. I really loved the comedy in this film. But back to Igor in Act 2. Igor is quite nice to Annie, minus the fight scene at the very beginning.
Sure.
There's some rustle and tussle and some things that Annie deservedly is pissed off about.
Yeah.
But through the rest of Act 2, and as we get to know Igor, he's very nice to Annie.
Yeah. Yes.
He's perceptive about Annie.
Very.
He sees something in Annie. And as the film goes on, we see that more and more. His perception and him really looking at this individual and seeing her for who she really is.
Yeah.
But despite his politeness to Annie throughout the rest of the film, Annie lashes out at him. Every time he does something nice, Annie is lashing out at him.
Sure.
He's kind of this character that sees Annie. He's this person that sees Annie as another person, not a prostitute or a little girl like they would say when they were trying to tie her up.
Right.
I saw him in that second act like a personified version of the viewer. Like he's just there and understanding, but he doesn't say much. I don't know. That's the way I saw it, and I loved it.
Man.
I thought it was so cool. It was like me being seen on the screen.
That's
that
really
makes
cool.
sense.
That's a cool perspective.
It's very interesting, dude. Yeah, he's super restrained. He's not throwing Annie around unnecessarily. He'd grab her and hold her, and she'd be talking all this shit to him, and he wouldn't let it bother him. And she, calls him horrible things, and he's like, whatever. And they go to this candy shop that all the Vanya and his crew and Ani would go to earlier in the movie and go smoke weed and eat candy. And he's told by Toros, like, all right, smash this place up. Chase, you just talked about this. Like, he seems to see people from who they are. When the guy comes out with a bat and he's like, all right, you guys get out of here. Igor doesn't take the bat and beat his ass with it. He just takes the bat and the dude just gives up. And then when he's smashing the store, he swings it a couple times, and then there's a glass of candy on top of the thing, and instead of just swinging at it like a fanatic, he just pokes his bat out and smashes it. Just does what he needs to do to make his little... Yeah. It's just like these little moments where these little choices, either that he was directed to do or chose to do himself, that like kind of speak to his characters. Like, I don't need to do any more than this to get to make my point or get the job done. And as a result. And I think you put this really well, dude. He is the most relatable character.
So then they find Vanya, and he's drunk in a strip club.
Yeah.
And they drag him out, and they go to the court to try and force his divorce. And Annie is still fighting it. She is still fighting for her marriage.
Yeah.
And at this point, they realize they need to go back to Vegas, and the parents show up, Vanya's parents, and they are pissed off.
Yeah.
And Annie turns to Vanya and says, stand up for me. Stand up for this marriage.
Yeah.
And Vanya says, no.
Yeah.
Of course we're getting a divorce. Are you stupid?
Right.
And in this moment, she realizes she is stupid. She realizes the dream is over.
Yes.
And for the first time, she doesn't fight back. The first time she's truly shocked and embarrassed and realizes, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
This whole time, people have been telling me that I'm an idiot. People have been telling me that this isn't real, and I've been fighting for it and fighting for it and fighting for it. Yeah. And in this moment, she realizes it isn't real.
Right.
Then we enter Act 3.
Right.
And Act 3 is really about Annie and Igor. Annie and Vanya get the divorce. Igor is in charge of taking Annie back to the house to collect her things. They spend the night, and then Annie's going home, and it's over.
Right. So that third act, Jordan, when she's been relegated to, it's over, this has been annulled, you can spend one more night in this house, and then you're getting your crap, and you're shuttling out the next day, would not have worked if not for a couple of reasons. The first time Annie's kind of walls come down a little bit is when Igor offers her the scarf. They're walking across the beach. It's freezing. He goes, I got this scarf. And she's like, is that the scarf you gagged me with? Like, I don't want that, you piece of shit. Like, why would I want that? And then 2 minutes later, she's like, it's freezing. Give me that goddamn thing.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah,
it's such a good little detail.
It is a good little detail. But it's not until she's defeated, Jordan, like you were saying. Her mom's like, hey, look, go ahead. You're going to go get a lawyer? I'm going to take your house. I'm going to take your family. You're going to be left with nothing. Whatever little you've got, I'm going to take. You're doing this.
Yeah.
And when she's utterly defeated, I think that is the only thing that allows her to finally be a little bit more vulnerable with Igor. She's still talking shit. She's still being a dick to him. He's still sitting there taking it. I mean, she literally accuses him of being a rapist. And he's like, what are you talking about? Because he's the way that he is, she channels all of her angst, all of her anger, all of her aggression towards him, because at this point he's proven that he can take it and he's not going to retaliate. And he's very measured and he's very restrained. He's obviously kind of smart enough, or he's perceptive enough to know this, and he allows it. One, probably because he has feelings for her, or at the very least, he sympathizes with her, which is the first time I think I, as an audience member, started to kind of empathize with her, because I really hadn't up to that point. Annie as a character never really grapples with her own responsibility for her choices. And I'm not talking about her as a profession. I'm not talking crap about that, but her greed. It's hard to glean from an audience member. Do they actually care for each other, or are they both using each other to kind of further their own agendas? So she never really grapples with that until that point, until she's told, I'll take everything, you're done. You're not winning this situation. So that conversation that they have while she's sitting on the floor and they're sharing cigarettes, and she keeps just talking shit to him, and he just keeps kind of absorbing it. It does work, but it would have only worked had everything kind of fallen into place the way it needed to prior to that.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. There's a couple of really important things we learn in Act 3. Number one, that Vanya is the stereotypical narcissistic rich kid.
Yeah.
Narcissism exists in all wealth classes, but there's nothing worse than a rich narcissist, because their power allows them to really use and abuse people.
Yep.
And Vanya uses, abuses, and discards Annie and doesn't care. He doesn't even think twice about it.
Right.
But what's most important is what we learn about Igor. And as you said, Igor just continues to be nice, and Annie just attacks, and he's not taking it personally. Throughout this whole movie, we watch Igor perceive Annie for who she really is. And one thing that I think is so important in Act 3, that's kind of the exclamation point on the whole message of this story, is her name is Anora, and yet the entire movie she's referred to as Annie. And anytime anyone calls her Anora, she corrects them and says, my name is Annie, call me Annie.
Great point, dude.
And he says, your name is Anora, and Anora means light.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then he says something that's so subtle but so important. I prefer Anora to Annie.
Mm-hmm.
And what he's saying in this moment is, I see you for you. I don't see this character of Annie, the stripper.
Yeah.
I see Anora, and she is light, and that's what I prefer in you. And he has fallen in love with that.
Yeah.
And I think this is such a cool way to make this point, to use their names to make this point.
The way the movie communicates the care that he has for her is really interesting and effective.
Yeah.
Everybody's just kind of looking out for themselves the entire movie.
Yeah.
And so this contrast with them and then Igor, who's he almost doesn't have an ego. It's like he's just watching everybody like a fly on the wall.
Yeah. He's not doing what he's doing out of sympathy or admiration for Anora. He seems to be doing it out of compassion.
Yeah.
He's like that consistently. He maintains that compassion and integrity throughout. I mean, you could maybe say the same of Toros and that whole group of quote unquote thugs. That it was interesting and kind of refreshing to see characters like that kind of go against type. But yeah, especially with Igor, man, it's interesting. It's probably the most interesting character in the movie.
So at the end of the movie, they're in the car. Igor is dropping Annie off at her house, and he pulls out the ring.
Yeah.
And he gives her the ring, and Annie is shocked because
yeah.
A, this ring has got to be incredibly valuable.
Sure.
And B, again, it's a little sign that Igor really cares about her.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
He could have kept the ring for himself, but he
Yeah.
didn't. He
Yeah.
gave it to her.
Yeah.
It was her ring.
Yeah. And it doesn't feel like pity.
No, absolutely not.
No.
And she responds by, again, talking trash
Yeah.
about his stupid car. And he says, this is my grandma's car.
Right.
Like, this is my grandma's car. And it's the third or fourth time he's mentioned his grandma throughout the film. And I think it's this moment that Annie realizes this person cares about his family.
Yes.
He cares about other people.
Yes.
He's compassionate. He's sensitive. And for the first time, she finally recognizes all of the nice deeds in
Yeah.
Igor.
Yeah.
And she recognizes that this person is a really good person.
Right.
And she allows herself for a moment to recognize the feelings that she has developed for him.
Right.
And how does she respond? The way she's learned to respond as an escort.
Yeah.
She shows her appreciation through sex.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a very transactional, fake form of connection.
Yeah.
We see this throughout the whole movie, and that's what she just reverts to.
Yeah.
So she shows her appreciation to Igor by initiating sex with him in the car.
Right.
And this is such a powerful scene because Igor stops and he grabs her and he looks her in the eyes and he tries to kiss her and he tries to make this more than just sex. He tries to really connect with her. And at first she fights against it.
Yeah.
It like really forcefully. It's a
Yeah.
little shocking.
Very much so.
Her initial reaction is just to fight this. Like,
Yeah.
this real connection is not something that Annie's used to.
Yeah.
And it's something that she's learned through her work as a stripper to fight against. And that's exactly what she does.
Yeah.
She enters this transactional form of showing appreciation. And as soon as it becomes more real, she cuts it off.
It looks physically painful
It-
for them to have eye contact in that moment.
Yes.
Yeah. And she attacks him and he stops her. And then she just breaks down.
Yeah.
And in that moment, we see all of the emotion that has
Yeah.
been building throughout this
Yeah.
entire film come breaking through. And with force, she hugs Igor
Yep.
and Igor hugs her back. And I found this scene to be both incredibly beautiful and also incredibly heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also a little disturbing, I think. And there's two
Yeah.
things that strike me about that scene. One is when he gives her the ring. He gives her the ring and then immediately gets out of the car and says, "Don't tell Toros I gave this to you." So he expected nothing in return for returning this ring to her. I almost think that is what sealed the deal for her. Like, not only did he go out of his way to get this thing back, which couldn't have been easy, it wasn't telegraphed either. And then the fact that he gives it to her and then he gets out of the car, takes her bags up the stairs, and he's ready to be done with it. Like, he's not asking for anything in return. So when we see this moment of forcefulness, I actually got kind of nervous. I thought, oh shit, what's going to go on here? But then,
Just for half a second.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then it's really well played because then all of a sudden that switches to, in that moment, he immediately realizes what she needs. And that's an awkward moment to switch from a moment of passion to a moment of nurture. And the two things can go hand in hand, obviously, and that he fully embraces her when she collapses on him. And it's such an awkward position for them both to be in. And then it's vulnerable in one way when it starts. It's vulnerable in a very, very different way when it ends. And I wasn't sure how I felt about that ending, to be honest with you guys. Because it was telegraphed through so many kind of scenes earlier in the movie, we know that Igor's kind of been, maybe not deliberately, it wasn't his agenda, but he had been chipping away at her tough exterior for some time. And I don't know, man. She was so opportunistic for me to sympathize with her. It was tough, but I wanted to see kind of Igor achieve what he was trying to do in some sense, which is, I think, was just be there for her, show her some kindness. Beautiful scene, awkward, maybe the most real moment. Actually, it was the most real moment in the whole movie by a long shot.
I loved the scene. I thought it was great. And I still had that kind of question of like, oh shoot.
Yeah.
Like, could this guy be a creep? Like, that would really suck.
Oh yeah.
And it took me back to one of the earlier parts in the film when he's first introduced and he's tying her up and the other goon walks in and they're in a
compromising
suggestive position.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, if this guy's a creep, that's really gonna suck.
Yeah.
Like, don't.
But you also expect him to be a creep.
Yeah,
because
you do.
he's the Russian goon. He's the muscle. He's the guy that comes in to
He's quiet. He's steely-eyed.
Even after gaining his trust, you feel it again.
Yeah.
That same thing right at the end.
Yeah.
I thought it was so good.
It was. Bold choice, but good, yeah.
Yeah.
So, guys, the time has come. I want to know exactly how good you really thought this was. Let's rate the film 1 to 5.
I loved this film. I thought it was so good. I was shocked to find out that Sean Baker wrote it, edited it, and also directed it.
Yeah.
As he does all his films.
Yep. It's a big lift, though.
So admirable. And his passion for this story and for this film shows in every shot. I'm going to give it 5 stars.
Hot damn. Look at that. Well, okay. This is a tricky one, man. So, again, I wasn't as challenged as I thought I would be. And that's based off of Sean Baker's prior works. His other films, I feel like, are far more complex and far more realistic. Anora is kind of a riff on a common character trope that we've seen before. And it didn't allow her to be a more memorable character, I don't think. That said, it's a good film. It's very well crafted, extremely well paced, especially for its runtime. You don't feel the slightly over 2 hours runtime. Mikey Madison, who plays Anora, I didn't feel like her performance was exceptional. It's not like when you see a lot of these Oscar movies where you've got somebody's performance and there's this massive amount of range that they exhibit on screen. I didn't feel like she really did that. She was very good, but I don't feel like any one particular performance in this movie was exceptional. There's some character development that's missing from this movie a little bit. I think it just makes a 4 for me.
So I recognize why someone would not want to see Anora. This film is about a stripper. There is over 500 F words. There are scenes that are difficult and uncomfortable. This is not a film for the masses. But for anyone who can look past that sort of thing, there's a message here that I do think is wonderful.
Yeah.
Again, Sean Baker is incredible at telling stories about people who are in difficult situations, who are on the fringes of society, who are in morally compromising positions. He brings a reality and a humanity to them that I enjoy, that I connect with, that I appreciate. This is not a perfect film, but I think it's close. I'm going to give it 4 stars. We want to know, what did you think about Anora? Please tell us. If you enjoyed Anora and are interested in exploring more from the director Sean Baker, I highly recommend the film The Florida Project from 2017. The Florida Project introduces us to a single mother and her daughter who are poor and homeless as they do what they can to survive. The story largely focuses on the young girl who is too often unsupervised and unprotected while drug deals, prostitution, and violence take place around her, all under the magical shadow of Disney World. The film is emotionally challenging, but it's also a real and honest portrayal with characters that you can't help but care deeply for. It stars Brooklyn Prince, Bria Vinate, and William Dafoe. I love this film and think of it often. It's one I highly recommend. Thank you for listening to Faster Film Critic, and please join us next week when we talk Alto Nights, directed by Barry Levinson. You can also follow us on Letterboxd, Cinetrek, and Instagram. Email us at fasterfilmcritic@gmail.com. Hit us up with questions, comments, feedback, or review requests, and please share this episode with your movie-loving friends.